What if history didn't begin where we think it did? What if the story we tell about civilization, a slow, steady climb from primitive tools to advanced technology, is not wrong, but incomplete? Most histories begin with a beginning, a first city, a first king, a first invention. But what if what we call the beginning was already a return? Across the ancient world, the earliest traces of civilization appear strangely mature. Stonework without rough drafts, geometry without experimentation, writing systems that arrive already functional, monuments aligned not just to the land, but to the sky. These are not answers. They are patterns, and patterns invite questions. What if humanity has crossed this threshold before? What if knowledge doesn't always accumulate, but sometimes survives? What if myths are not fantasies, but compressed memories of events too vast, too traumatic, to be remembered any other way? This story is not a claim. It is a speculative reconstruction based on ancient texts, recurring historical patterns, and unresolved anomalies. It does not assert certainty. It asks what might be missing. Because when we look closely, ancient history often behaves less like a birth and more like an aftermath. A world rebuilt after something collapsed, a silence between cycles. Tonight, we are not searching for who they were. We are listening for what may have been remembered. And if civilization did not begin once, but restarted, then the most important part of the story may not be the rise. It may be what came before the silence. What if the problem isn't that ancient people were less advanced than we imagine, but that we've misunderstood when certain knowledge appears? History usually tells a familiar story. Civilization rises slowly. First, simple tools, then agriculture, then cities, then writing, then complex engineering. Each step builds on the last. But what if the archaeological record doesn't always follow that order? What if, in some places, complexity appears too early and too complete? Across the ancient world, we find structures that don't look experimental. They don't look like first attempts. They look finished. Stone cut with precision, where only simple tools are supposed to exist. Massive monuments erected before agriculture could support large populations. Cities with sanitation systems more advanced than anything Europe would build thousands of years later. Calendars, alignments, and measurements that require long-term observation, appearing suddenly, without visible trial and error. What if these aren't isolated miracles? What if they're signals? Consider the timing. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines vanished. Vast lowlands were swallowed by the ocean. Entire landscapes that would have been ideal for early settlement are now underwater. What if something existed there? What if the civilizations we call ancient emerged not from untouched wilderness, but from a world already altered by loss? When we examine early monumental sites, a strange pattern repeats. The oldest examples are often the most ambitious. Later ones are smaller, less precise, sometimes structurally inferior. What if progress isn't always forward? What if, in some cases, it moves backward, from mastery toward approximation? And then there's writing. Writing doesn't arrive as a clumsy experiment. It appears capable, structured, immediately useful for accounting, law, astronomy, and ritual. What if writing wasn't invented to create civilization, but to preserve something already slipping away? What if it emerged because memory alone was no longer enough? Across different cultures, we also encounter the same unsettling theme. Stories of a world destroyed, of floods, fire, darkness, and collapse. Of survivors who carried knowledge into a changed landscape. Of teachers who arrived afterward, not to invent civilization, but to restore it. These stories are separated by oceans and millennia. They use different symbols, different names, but they follow the same structure. What if that's not coincidence? What if mythology is not the opposite of history, but history compressed, encoded, and protected from forgetting? We're often told that ancient anomalies can be explained one by one, that each site, each structure, each outlier has a reasonable explanation on its own. Maybe that's true. But what if the real tension appears only when we stop looking at them individually and start seeing them as a pattern? Because patterns don't prove anything, but they do apply pressure. And under enough pressure, even a stable story begins to crack. To understand why these early civilizations look less like beginnings and more like recoveries, we need to step back. Not to the rise of civilization, but to the conditions that may have existed before it. To a time when the world changed faster than memory could keep up. To a silence in the record. And to the possibility that what followed was not humanity's first attempt, but its return. What civilization usually looks like, and why something doesn't match. In most places, civilization leaves a very specific kind of trail. Not just monuments, but mess. Early tools look improvised. Early buildings look uncertain. Early systems look like they're trying and failing before they finally work. You see rough versions first, then better versions, then standards. That's how most human skills grow. Pottery starts uneven, cracked, inconsistent. Then the clay improves, the firing improves, shapes become repeatable. Metallurgy begins with small accidents, soft copper, brittle mixtures, experiments that break. Only later do alloys stabilize. Only later do techniques spread. Even writing, in a typical model, should begin as fragments. Marks, tally lines, simple symbols that slowly become a system, and cities, if they form organically, carry scars of learning. Bad drainage, crowded streets, collapsed walls, rebuilt walls. The earliest phases should look like practice, because practice is visible. It leaves failures behind. So here's the quiet question. If civilization truly started in a given place, why don't we always find the practice? Why do some early sites feel less like experiments and more like arrivals? And if those arrivals are real, then the next question is even harder. What happened to the rough versions that should have existed first? Mistakes usually don't disappear. In the archaeological record, failure tends to accumulate. Walls crack and are reinforced badly. Floors sink and are raised unevenly. Foundations shift. forcing later builders to compensate rather than correct. You can often read a settlement like a notebook, layer by layer, attempt by attempt. A street that curves awkwardly because it followed a footpath before it was paved. A building that doesn't quite align because measurement systems weren't standardized yet. A drainage channel that floods until someone widens it, too late for the first generation. This is how learning announces itself. Not through perfection, but through correction. That's why archaeologists expect early phases to look inefficient, wasteful, overbuilt in some places, underbuilt in others. Because when people don't yet know what works, they build their way toward it, which makes the absence of visible error strangely important. Because when error is missing, it doesn't mean it never happened. It means it may have happened somewhere else. Standards are not where civilization begins. They are where it settles. Units of measurement don't appear fully formed. They emerge after long disagreement, after arguments about length, weight, volume, time. Before standards, there is approximation. A foot that depends on whose foot you use. A cubit that changes from place to place. A day measured by light, not by precision. Only after repetition do societies agree on sameness. Bricks become uniform because variability slows construction. Angles become consistent because alignment starts to matter. Calendars stabilize because agriculture, ritual, and administration demand predictability. In other words, standards are a solution to accumulated chaos. They require memory. They require comparison. They require a shared sense of what correct even means. So when standardized systems appear very early, uniform bricks, fixed angles, consistent proportions, they raise a subtle but uncomfortable question. What was being standardized against? Because standards don't emerge in a vacuum. They emerge in response to something already known, which leads to the tension at the heart of this pattern. What if some early civilizations didn't spend generations arguing their way toward standards, but inherited them? And if that's possible, then what we call early civilization may already be a second draft. When something is learned for the first time, it leaves versions behind. Not just one beginning, but many attempts clustered close together. You expect to see overlap, old methods used alongside new ones, inefficient solutions slowly replaced by better ones. In early cities, this usually means layers that contradict each other. A building technique abandoned halfway through a settlement's life. A measurement system adjusted, then adjusted again. A calendar corrected after it fails to predict the seasons. These drafts don't vanish. They fossilize. They remain in the ground as evidence of uncertainty. That's why archaeologists don't just look for what worked. They look for what didn't. So when early civilizations appear with consistent layouts, mature construction logic, integrated systems that already work together, the question isn't, how impressive is this? The question is quieter. Where is the uncertainty? Where are the overlapping experiments? Where are the competing standards? Where are the visible debates frozen in stone and mud? If they're missing, there are only a few possibilities. Either they never existed, or they existed somewhere else, or they existed earlier and didn't survive. And that final possibility opens the door to a very different way of reading ancient history. Because if the drafts are gone, but the final versions remain, then what we're seeing may not be civilization learning for the first time, but civilization remembering what it already knew. This doesn't mean early civilizations were impossible. It doesn't mean the people were incapable of learning, experimenting, or inventing. It means something subtler. If learning normally leaves behind hesitation, revision, and visible trial, and if, in some cases, those traces are faint or missing, then the story may not be as simple as first time. Because absence is also data. When the ground preserves tools, walls, and trash for thousands of years, but does not preserve uncertainty, it forces a reconsideration. What if the earliest civilizations we recognize archaeologically are not the first chapter of the story, but the first chapter that survived? What if earlier experiments existed in places now lost, along coastlines swallowed by rising seas, on plains erased by shifting climates, in settlements built from materials that didn't endure? And what if what did endure were the systems already refined enough to be worth preserving? If that's even partially true, then the absence of drafts isn't a mystery. It's a filter. Only what worked well enough, long enough, survived the reset. Which means the next question isn't about failure, it's about transmission. If knowledge didn't begin here, how did it arrive here at all? And that is where the story has to move next. From how civilizations usually grow, to why, in some places, growth seems to have skipped its earliest steps. Once you notice what should be there, its absence becomes difficult to ignore. Archaeology is not only the study of what survives, it is also the study of what should have survived, but didn't. Early villages usually leave behind clutter, broken tools, half-working systems, transitional forms that exist only briefly before being replaced. These traces are common. They appear in many regions, across many periods. So when an early civilization presents itself with coordinated planning, mature construction logic, systems that already interact smoothly, the absence of earlier drafts stops being neutral. It becomes informative. What if the missing drafts were not destroyed randomly, but selectively? What if the conditions that erased earlier attempts were the same conditions that allowed only the most resilient knowledge to persist? Fire doesn't preserve wood. Floods don't preserve mud brick. Rising seas don't preserve coastal settlements. But stone survives. Geometry survives. Alignment survives. What if what we call early civilization is simply what passed through a very narrow gate? And if that gate was catastrophe, then the civilizations we recognize may not be the first to experiment, but the first to rebuild after experimentation was no longer possible. Which leads to an even more unsettling thought. If knowledge survived a collapse once, what form would it take when it reappeared? Not as theory, not as gradual invention, but as practice, as systems already tested and now applied again. When something is rediscovered rather than invented, it doesn't announce itself with uncertainty. It arrives quietly, already shaped by prior use. People don't debate whether it works. They debate how to apply it. This is an important distinction. Invention is loud. It generates disagreement, failed models, competing approaches. You can see the struggle in the material record. Recovered knowledge behaves differently. It skips the argument phase. It moves straight to execution. What if some early civilizations weren't experimenting with new ideas, but applying principles they no longer fully understood, only trusted? That would explain a strange tension we see again and again. Structures that are incredibly precise, but whose purpose seems partially forgotten. Techniques that work, but are never pushed further. Systems that appear complete, then slowly degrade over time. Because when knowledge is inherited without context, it becomes conservative. You don't improve it, you preserve it. You repeat what you know works, because the reason why it works has already been lost. This could explain why later cultures often imitate earlier monuments, but rarely surpass them. Why later pyramids are smaller. Why later stonework is less precise. Why later systems simplify instead of evolve. Not because people became less intelligent, but because they were working from memory, not mastery. And memory behaves differently than invention. Memory resists change. It values continuity over innovation. So, if some ancient technologies appear suddenly, fully formed, and then gradually decline rather than improve, what if that curve isn't evidence of primitive limitation? What if it's evidence of inheritance? And if that's the case, then the real mystery isn't how early civilizations learned so quickly. It's where that earlier learning took place, and why it didn't survive in the same form. Which brings us closer to a difficult possibility, that the missing drafts weren't missing at all. They were erased. Erasure doesn't have to be intentional to be complete. Most human knowledge has always been fragile. Spoken words vanish with the speaker. Wood rots. Textiles decay. Clay dissolves back into earth. Only a narrow category of things endures. Stone, certain metals, and patterns abstract enough to survive translation. If an earlier phase of civilization relied on materials that didn't last, coastal settlements, timber structures, organic tools, perishable records, its physical footprint would be faint even without catastrophe. Now add rapid environmental change, rising seas that swallow shorelines, floods that scour river valleys, firestorms that erase forests and grasslands, climate shifts that turn habitable regions into deserts. What survives a process like that is not everyday life. What survives is what was already built to endure. This reframes the absence of early drafts in a critical way. What if the problem isn't that early civilizations left no learning curve, but that we're only seeing the portion of the curve that could pass through extreme filtering? In that case, stone monuments are not the beginning of complexity. They are the residue. They represent what remained after everything else failed. Which means the archaeological record may not be lying. It may simply be incomplete by design of survival. And if that's true, then what we call early civilization might actually be the most durable layer of a much longer story. A layer formed after loss, after compression, after forgetting. Which brings us to a crucial transition. If knowledge was filtered by catastrophe, then it wouldn't reappear as explanation or theory. it would reappear as ritual, as form, as alignment, as things done because they were remembered, not because they were fully understood. And that is where the story begins to change direction. From how civilizations usually grow to how memory moves across cultures, and why the same patterns keep returning, even when everything else is different. At some point, memory stops being enough. In small groups, knowledge can live in people. Techniques are demonstrated. Stories are repeated. Skills are passed from hand to hand. But as societies grow, or as knowledge fragments, memory becomes fragile. Details slip. Sequences break, meaning erodes. That's usually when writing appears, not as poetry, not as philosophy, but as control. Lists, inventories, records of who owes what and when. Calendars that keep rituals from drifting out of season. In the conventional story, writing is an invention driven by complexity. But what if, in some cases, it was driven by loss? What if writing didn't emerge because people suddenly needed civilization, but because they were afraid of forgetting something they already had? Writing, in that light, is not creativity. It's insurance. A way to freeze knowledge when oral transmission begins to fail. And that raises a subtle question. Why do some of the earliest writing systems appear already capable of handling complexity? Accounting, law, astronomy, ritual sequences that depend on precise timing. These are not beginner problems. They assume an existing framework, something worth preserving accurately. What if writing didn't start as an experiment in communication, but as an emergency measure? A response to a moment when continuity could no longer be trusted. And if writing is preservation rather than invention, then the knowledge it records may be older than the medium itself, which leads to the next tension. If writing was used to hold on to something that was slipping away, what exactly was being held? And how much of it survived intact? That question pulls us forward, from missing drafts and filtered knowledge, to the idea that some civilizations may have begun not by creating systems, but by trying to remember them. When a system is invented from scratch, it usually struggles to find its purpose. Early versions are limited, awkward, overly simple. They solve one problem at a time. But some of the earliest known writing systems don't behave that way. They don't begin with stories. They don't begin with art. They begin with structure. They track quantities. They regulate exchange. They mark time. They formalize obligation. From their earliest appearances, they already know what they are for. This is unusual, because purpose usually emerges after experimentation, not before. What if writing, in these cases, wasn't discovering its function, but reclaiming it? What if the people using early writing systems already understood that information needed to be stored, checked, compared, and transmitted reliably, even if they no longer remembered where that need originally came from? That would explain something subtle but important. Why writing often appears tightly coupled with administration, ritual, and astronomy. Why it shows up in temples and storehouses rather than homes. Why it's controlled, restricted, and sometimes sacred. If writing is preservation, then access matters. You don't let everyone alter the memory. You guard it. Which means early writing may not reflect the birth of literacy, but the consolidation of authority over what was remembered and how. And that shifts the frame again. Writing doesn't just store knowledge, it selects it. It decides what survives. And if only fragments made it through, then the written record may represent not the totality of ancient understanding, but the portion considered essential enough to save. Which brings us to an uncomfortable possibility. What if some of the most important knowledge never made it into writing at all? And if so, where did it go? Writing is powerful, but it is also limited. It excels at lists, at quantities, at sequences that can be broken into symbols. It struggles with intuition, with spatial understanding, with techniques that live in the body rather than the page. You can write down numbers, you can record dates, you can describe a ritual, but you can't easily write down how it feels to balance a massive stone, or how to sense stress in a structure before it fails, or how to read the sky as a moving system rather than a static chart. Some knowledge resists inscription. It survives better through practice, through apprenticeship, through repetition across generations. If a civilization were forced to compress its knowledge quickly, because populations scattered, because environments changed, because continuity broke, then writing would capture only part of what mattered. The rest would have to live elsewhere, in habit, in ritual, in architecture, in alignment. This may explain a curious divide we see in early civilizations. The written record feels administrative, transactional, concerned with order. But the built record, the monuments, the layouts, the orientations, feels mathematical, astronomical, almost instructional, as if stone carried what symbols could not. What if writing was never meant to hold everything? What if it functioned as a scaffold, a way to stabilize society, while deeper knowledge was embedded into form itself? If that's the case, then the most important information from the ancient world may not be found in texts at all. It may be found in proportions, in angles, in placements that repeat across cultures. And that realization shifts our attention once again, away from scripts and symbols, and toward the structures that were built to endure when memory could not. Which brings us to the next step in the pattern. Because once knowledge becomes embedded in form, it no longer needs to be explained. It only needs to be repeated. Sameness is not a natural starting point. Left to itself, human building varies. Hands differ. Materials differ. Judgment differs. Early work is usually personal, irregular, adapted moment by moment. Uniformity takes effort. It requires agreement, not just on how to do something, but on what counts as correct. A brick must be this size. An angle must be this precise. A structure must face this direction. That kind of consistency doesn't emerge instantly. It has to be enforced, taught, and repeated. So when we encounter very early sites with standardized brick dimensions, consistent geometric ratios, repeated orientations to cardinal directions, the question isn't how skilled the builders were, it's how agreement appeared so quickly. What if these standards weren't negotiated locally? What if they were inherited? Standards don't just make construction easier, they preserve intention. They ensure that something built in one generation matches what was built in another. Which raises a deeper question. If standards appear early, what were they trying to remain faithful to? And faithful to whom? Because standards are not creative tools, they are conservative ones. They exist to keep something from changing. And that suggests that by the time some civilizations began building, there was already something they were trying not to lose, something already defined, something remembered. And if that's true, then standards may not mark the start of civilization, but its attempt at continuity. Standards don't just organize labor, they encode decisions. Every fixed measure is a choice that has already been made. Every repeated proportion is a judgment that no longer needs to be argued. Once a society adopts standards, it stops asking whether something should be done that way. It only asks how closely it can be reproduced. That's why standards are powerful, and why they are rarely born at the beginning. They are born after something has proven itself. After success has been repeated often enough, the deviation feels like risk. So when early civilizations show stable measurement systems, repeated geometric relationships, architectural ratios that remain consistent across generations, it suggests a strange reversal. Instead of experimentation leading to standards, standards appear to lead construction. As if the blueprint existed before the building. What if some early societies weren't deciding what worked, but preserving what had already worked once before? That would explain why certain proportions feel almost untouchable. Why orientations repeat even when geography makes them inconvenient. Why builders go to enormous effort to maintain alignment, symmetry, and ratio, even when simpler solutions were available. Because when a standard is inherited, rather than invented, breaking it feels dangerous, not inefficient, not inelegant. Dangerous. As if deviation might cause something to fail, not immediately, but eventually, which introduces a new layer to the pattern. What if standards weren't about beauty or order at all? What if they were about stability, about ensuring that knowledge embedded in form continued to function, even when the reason for that function had already been forgotten? If so, then the uniformity we see in early civilizations isn't evidence of cultural rigidity. It's evidence of caution. A society repeating something it trusts without fully remembering why. And that brings us to the edge of Act 1. Because once standards exist, once writing preserves fragments, once monuments encode principles in stone. The next question is unavoidable. Where did the original template come from? And why does it seem to surface already complete at the very moment civilization is supposed to be beginning? When a society understands why something works, it feels free to modify it, to improve it, to adapt it to new conditions. But when understanding is partial, continuity becomes more important than change. You don't adjust the ratio. You don't rotate the structure. You don't alter the sequence. You repeat it exactly, because it worked before. This kind of repetition is not creative. It's protective. It suggests a relationship to knowledge that is cautious, almost reverent. As if the builders were aware that the system they were using was more fragile than it looked. And this may explain something subtle about early civilizations. why they invest so much effort in precision, even when it isn't visibly necessary, why they maintain alignments across centuries, why proportions repeat across regions, why deviations feel rare and hesitant. What if these standards weren't aesthetic preferences, but safety margins? Rules designed to keep something functioning when deeper understanding had already thinned. That would mean early civilizations weren't operating at the beginning of a learning curve. They were operating at the edge of forgetting, preserving form because explanation was no longer reliable, repeating structure because theory had already slipped away. And that reframes the entire question of development. Instead of asking why ancient societies progressed so quickly, we might ask why they were so careful, why they chose continuity over innovation, why they guarded certain patterns so tightly, why they built as if deviation carried consequences. If civilization were truly starting from zero, risk would be acceptable. Failure would be expected. But if civilization were rebuilding from fragments, risk would be dangerous. Because when you don't fully understand a system, you don't experiment with it. You preserve it. And that realization closes ACT-1. Because once we accept that some early civilizations may have been operating in preservation mode, not discovery mode, the story shifts from how civilizations normally grow to why memory itself may have become the most valuable resource. Memory across cultures. Across different continents, early civilizations seem to face the same quiet problem. Not how to invent everything from nothing, but how to keep anything from being lost. Because after disruption, the first thing that breaks isn't stone, it's continuity. The chain of teaching, the patience of long observation, the slow accumulation that normally turns skill into mastery. And when that chain breaks, something changes in the way societies build. They become less experimental, less willing to improvise, more focused on repeating what feels stable. What if the earliest civilizations we recognize were not simply early, but careful? Careful in the way people are careful when they suspect they are working with fragments. And if that's true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What if the most important ancient technology wasn't a tool, but the ability to preserve memory across a break in time? When memory is stretched across generations, it changes shape. Details fade first. Names shift. Causes blur. What survives is structure. Beginning. Disruption. Survival. Return. Across cultures that never met, myths follow this same sequence. Not the same characters, not the same symbols, the same order. What if myths were never meant to preserve facts in the modern sense? What if they functioned more like compression, reducing something vast and traumatic into a form that could survive repetition? A story short enough to remember, simple enough to retell, flexible enough to adapt to new landscapes and languages. In that sense, myth is not fiction. It's a storage format, not designed for accuracy, but for survival. And that would explain why flood stories, destruction stories, renewal stories sound so similar even when everything else is different. Not because cultures copied each other, but because they were preserving the same kind of memory. A memory of interruption, a reminder that the world had ended once before, and that civilization when it returned, did not begin cleanly. It resumed. In many ancient traditions, civilization does not emerge on its own. It is reintroduced. After destruction, figures appear. They don't arrive as conquerors. They arrive as instructors. They teach people how to count, how to measure land, how to track the sky, how to rebuild order. What's striking is not who these figures are supposed to be, but when they appear. Always after the catastrophe, never at the true beginning. What if these stories aren't describing divine origins, but moments of transfer? Moments when knowledge moved from those who remembered to those who didn't. In that reading, gods are not beings. They are roles, carriers of memory, stabilizers in a broken world, those who knew enough to restart systems, but not enough to recreate the full context. And that would explain something subtle. Why early civilizations often describe themselves not as inventors, but as restorers. Why they speak of golden ages behind them. Why progress is framed as return, not ascent. If knowledge arrived this way, through teaching after loss, then it would be treated with caution, not questioned, not modified, preserved. Because when knowledge is all you have left, you don't experiment with it. You protect it. And that instinct shapes everything that follows. Stories adapt to the people who tell them. Names change. Symbols shift. Meanings soften or harden, depending on the culture that inherits them. Over generations, a story can drift far from its origin and still survive. Architecture does not have that flexibility. A structure either stands or it fails. Its orientation is fixed. Its proportions are locked in place. Its relationship to light, water, gravity, and sky does not reinterpret itself. If something needed to be preserved with minimal distortion, architecture would be the most reliable container. What if ancient builders understood this intuitively? What if they chose stone and geometry not for symbolism, but for stability of memory? In that case, the repetition we see across cultures wouldn't be aesthetic coincidence. It would be functional convergence. Different peoples, facing different conditions, arriving at the same solution for the same problem. How do you carry knowledge forward when explanation can no longer be trusted? And if architecture became the vessel for memory, then its repetition is not redundancy, it's intent. A signal that something important was being carried across time, quietly, without words. Once memory is embedded in form, it no longer needs to be explained. It only needs to be repeated. A story must be taught. A ritual must be remembered. A text must be copied correctly. But a building enforces itself. You walk where the walls allow. You face the direction the structure demands. You move through space in a sequence decided long before you arrived. This is a different kind of transmission, not symbolic, behavioral. What if ancient architecture was designed to guide action rather than understanding? To make people do the right thing, even if they no longer knew why it mattered. That would explain why so many ancient structures feel instructional. Stairs that control movement, courtyards that regulate gathering, alignments that force attention to specific moments in the sky. The structure becomes the teacher. And teachers don't need to speak, if the lesson is built into the environment. This also explains why architectural principles survive even when languages vanish. You can forget the story, you can mistranslate the myth, you can lose the text entirely. But as long as the structure stands, the behavior it enforces remains intact. If this is how memory crossed cultural boundaries, then repetition is not failure of imagination. It is success of design. The same solution, working again and again, even when everything else changes. When architecture carries memory, deviation becomes risky. You can reinterpret a story without consequence. You can rename a god. You can alter a myth to fit a new culture. But you cannot casually change a structure that was built to work. If an alignment ensured seasonal timing, you keep the alignment. If a proportion stabilized a structure against stress, you keep the proportion. If a layout regulated movement, sound, or water, you keep the layout, even if you no longer remember the reason. This creates a very specific behavior pattern. Builders repeat forms faithfully. They copy ratios exactly. They orient structures consistently, even when geography makes it inconvenient. From the outside, this can look like tradition, or superstition, or blind imitation. But what if it was caution? What if ancient builders sensed that these designs were not arbitrary, that they had consequences? In that case, repetition isn't conservatism, it's risk management. You don't experiment with a system when you don't fully understand its failure modes. You preserve it. And that explains why architecture can look frozen in time even as cultures change around it. Languages evolve, political systems rise and fall, myths fragment. But the structures remain stubbornly consistent. Because once memory is stored in form, form becomes the authority. And authority doesn't argue. Over time, this kind of repetition produces a strange effect. Architecture begins to feel older than the culture using it. Later, builders inherit forms without inheriting their origins. They reproduce layouts, proportions, and orientations because that is how it has always been done. Not because they can explain it, but because deviation feels wrong. This creates layers of continuity without understanding. A civilization may change its language, its rulers, even its gods, while continuing to build in the same way. From the outside, it can look like stagnation. From the inside, it feels like responsibility, a duty to maintain something larger than any one generation. If this is how architectural memory functions, then the similarities we see across distant cultures don't require contact. They require inheritance. Different peoples, facing similar breaks in continuity, choosing the same strategy. Preserve what works. Repeat what endures. Trust the form. And that brings us to a crucial transition. Because if architecture carried memory forward, then there should be places where that memory appears suddenly, without local preparation. Places where monumental construction arrives too early, too coordinated, too intentional. Places that look less like invention and more like recall. And one such place stands at the very edge of the known timeline, a site that forces us to ask whether civilization truly began there, or simply resurfaced. Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe does not feel like a beginning. It feels deliberate, There is no visible learning curve, no gradual increase in complexity, no clear sequence of trial and correction. The site appears with confidence. Massive stone pillars are quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with a coordination that implies planning, shared intention, and a clear idea of what the finished form should be. What makes this unsettling is not just the scale, but the timing. Göbekli Tepe appears before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before pottery, before writing. According to conventional expectations, the social and economic systems required for such construction should not yet exist. And yet, the architecture does. What if Göbekli Tepe is not the place where complexity was invented, but the place where it returned? A threshold moment, not a starting line, but a re-entry point. If memory had survived a rupture, fragmented, incomplete, but intact enough to guide action, this is what its first expression might look like. Not experimentation, not improvisation, but careful execution. A group of people doing something they believe must be done, even if they can no longer explain where the idea originally came from. And if Göbekli Tepe represents that threshold, then the question it raises is not about skill, it's about timing. Why does memory reappear here? And why does it take this form? To answer that, we need to look more closely at what was built and what the builders chose to do next. What stands out at Göbekli Tepe is not only what was built, but how it was treated afterward. The structures were not left to decay. They were not abandoned gradually. They were buried, carefully, deliberately, layer by layer. Thousands of tons of earth were used to fill the enclosures, sealing the pillars and reliefs beneath the ground. This is not what neglect looks like. Neglect leaves collapse, weathering, broken stones scattered by time. Burial leaves preservation. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why would a community invest immense effort to hide what it had just finished building? What if the burial was not an ending, but a decision? A recognition that the structure had fulfilled its role, or that the time for using it had passed. Some researchers suggest ritual closure. Others propose a shift in social organization. Still others see a response to environmental change. But what if the act of burial itself was part of memory preservation? What if sealing the site was a way of marking a boundary between before and after? A way of saying, this knowledge belongs to an earlier phase. If Göbekli Tepe was built by people carrying fragments of older understanding, then burying it may have been an acknowledgement that something was ending again. Not the first ending, but another. And if that's true, then Göbekli Tepe is not just a monument. It's a signal, a moment when memory surfaced long enough to be expressed, and then was intentionally placed back into silence. Which raises a deeper question. If this knowledge appeared once at the threshold, where else did it reappear? And how many times has history repeated this same quiet pattern? Göbekli Tepe does not stand alone. It feels like the first visible ripple of something larger, not an isolated anomaly, but an early signal that memory had begun to surface again. What makes this unsettling is what follows. After Göbekli Tepe is buried, Monumental architecture does not disappear. It moves. It reappears later in other regions, in different forms, under different names, as if the knowledge expressed there did not end, but dispersed. What if Göbekli Tepe was not meant to last as a functioning center? What if it was a marker, a calibration point, a place where fragments of memory were gathered, expressed once in stone, and then allowed to pass on, carried forward by people rather than preserved in place? In that reading, Göbekli Tepe is not a template to be copied directly. It is a transition, a moment when remembrance crossed a threshold from one cycle into the next, and that would explain something subtle. Why later civilizations do not replicate Göbekli Tepe exactly. Why its specific forms vanish while its principles persist. Orientation to the sky. Monumentality without habitation. Symbolism tied to animals, cycles, and death. Construction that prioritizes alignment over utility. These ideas survive. The site itself does not. Which suggests that Göbekli Tepe's role was never permanence. It was transmission. And if that's true, then to follow the trail of memory further, we can't stay in one place. We have to look outward, across cultures, across continents, to see where the same principles reemerge, and how they change as memory continues to thin. Because Göbekli Tepe may mark the moment remembrance returned. What comes next shows us how far it was carried, and how much was lost along the way. If Göbekli Tepe marks a threshold, then it should not be unique. A true restart would not concentrate knowledge in one place. It would scatter it. Fragments carried by groups moving into different landscapes, adapting what they remembered to new materials, new climates, new risks. What survives a restart is never uniform. It's selective. Some remember geometry. Some remember orientation to the sky. Some remember how to move stone. Some remember how to manage water, sound, or stress. Each culture rebuilds what it can with what it has. This could explain why the ancient world feels both connected and disconnected at the same time. The forms differ, the gods differ, the stories diverge, but the underlying priorities remain strangely familiar. Precision where it isn't strictly necessary. Monumentality without obvious function. Systems designed to endure catastrophe rather than convenience. What if these are not coincidences, but echoes? Not copies, but reinterpretations of the same fading memory. Göbekli Tepe may be the first place where this memory becomes visible again. What follows are its variations, each one slightly less complete, each one more adapted, each one further from the original context. And that distance matters, because as memory thins, form survives longer than meaning. Which means the further we move from the threshold, the more impressive the engineering can look, and the less certain we become about why it was done that way. That is the paradox of ancient civilization. The older the structure, the more confident it seems. The later the explanation, the less sure it becomes. And with that realization, the pattern opens outward. Göbekli Tepe is no longer the mystery, it is the reference point. To understand what was remembered and what was lost, we now have to follow the echoes, across regions, across materials, across time. When one anomaly repeats everywhere, or at this stage, it becomes important to change how we look, not at individual sites, not at isolated cultures, not at names, dates, or dynasties, but at patterns. Because a single anomaly can always be explained away. An exception, a local innovation, a coincidence of circumstance. But when the same characteristics appear in places separated by oceans, by thousands of years, by cultures with no known contact, the explanation has to change. What if the mystery isn't where these structures are found, but how they behave? Across the ancient world, certain traits repeat. Precision far beyond immediate necessity. Stone sizes larger than required for function. Orientation tied to celestial cycles rather than convenience. Engineering choices that prioritize durability over speed or efficiency. These are not stylistic similarities. They are behavioral ones. They suggest shared priorities, not shared aesthetics. And priorities are harder to transmit accidentally. You can imitate a shape. You can borrow a symbol. But you don't independently converge on the same constraints unless you are solving the same problem. So the question shifts again. What problem were these builders responding to? Not how to build a house, not how to impress a ruler, but how to make something last in a world that had already proven it could collapse. If civilization had already been interrupted once, then endurance would matter more than novelty. Stability would matter more than speed. And memory, encoded in stone, proportion, and orientation, would matter more than explanation. Seen this way, the ancient world stops looking like a collection of unrelated marvels. It starts to look like a distributed response to the same underlying fear, that what was built once could be lost again, and that the next collapse might erase even more. So builders across continents made the same quiet decision. If something mattered, it had to endure. And that decision left a signature we are still uncovering today. Once you stop focusing on names and locations, another detail becomes difficult to ignore. The scale often exceeds necessity. Many ancient structures are larger than they need to be, heavier than function requires, more precise than immediate use would demand. This is not how efficiency usually works. If the goal were shelter, smaller stones would suffice. If the goal were symbolism, lighter materials would be easier. If the goal were speed, rougher construction would be acceptable. And yet, again and again, builders choose the opposite. They move stones so large that even today the logistics remain uncomfortable to explain. They shape surfaces so precisely that the joints survive centuries of stress without mortar. They align structures so carefully that small errors would have rendered the effort pointless. What if this wasn't excess? What if it was insurance? Large stones resist movement. Precision resists erosion. Redundancy resists failure. In regions prone to earthquakes, walls flex instead of collapse. In flood zones, platforms rise above seasonal chaos. In unstable climates, orientation preserves timing even when conditions shift. What if ancient builders were not optimizing for daily life, but for survival across disruption? That would explain why the same construction logic appears in mountains, deserts, jungles, and islands. Different threats. Same response. Build as if the world might change suddenly. Build as if repair might not be possible. Build as if memory itself depends on the structure remaining intact. And if that was the priority, then the scale and precision stop looking excessive. They look deliberate. Not monuments to power, but anchors against forgetting. Which raises the next question. If these structures were designed to endure catastrophe, what kind of catastrophe were they expecting? And how did they know to expect it? Expectation leaves a signature. You can often tell what a society fears by what it prepares for. A culture that fears invasion builds walls. A culture that fears famine builds granaries. A culture that fears drought builds canals. But a culture that fears sudden collapse builds differently. It doesn't optimize for comfort. It optimizes for continuity. Across ancient sites, we see repeated attention to forces that operate beyond human control. Earthquakes, floods, seasonal extremes, long celestial cycles that outlast a lifetime. What if these builders were not reacting to everyday problems, but to remembered ones? A past where structures failed suddenly, where coastlines vanished, where familiar patterns of season and sky shifted too quickly to adapt. In that context, engineering becomes cautious. You don't build just to stand. You build to survive surprise. This would explain why some ancient constructions seem almost over-engineered, why foundations are deeper than required, why stones interlock rather than stack, why orientations favor long-term celestial stability over local convenience. These choices make sense if the builders expected disruption, not as a distant possibility, but as something that had already happened once before. And if that expectation was carried forward through memory, then even cultures separated by oceans would arrive at similar priorities. Not because they shared contact, but because they shared inheritance. A lesson learned the hard way, that the world is not always stable, and that what matters must be built as if stability cannot be assumed. Which brings us to the next layer of the pattern. Because preparing for disruption often means understanding forces you cannot see. And many ancient structures behave as if their builders were paying attention to exactly that. Some of the most deliberate choices in ancient construction respond to forces that cannot be seen. Not enemies, not weather alone, but pressures that move silently through the world. The ground shifts, energy travels through stone, sound resonates, water moves beneath the surface. Many ancient structures behave as if these forces were understood intuitively or remembered. Walls are not straight where earthquakes are common. They interlock. They flex. Platforms are raised not only above floods, but above uncertainty. Sound behaves strangely in enclosed spaces, amplifying or dissolving in ways that seem intentional. Water is guided gently, not forced, as if the builders knew resistance would eventually fail. What if ancient engineers weren't mastering materials, but listening to environments? Learning how energy moves through a place, how vibration travels, how pressure accumulates, how systems fail under stress. This kind of understanding doesn't come quickly. It requires long observation, repeated exposure, generations paying attention to the same patterns, which raises a quiet but unsettling thought. What if this knowledge wasn't acquired locally, but carried? passed on by people who had already seen what happens when these forces are ignored. In that case, the precision we see isn't technological arrogance, it's humility. A decision to work with forces larger than human intention. And if that attitude survived a collapse, it would explain why ancient architecture often feels less like domination over nature and more like negotiation with it. The builders weren't trying to conquer the world. They were trying not to lose it again. And that mindset, once established, would travel far. Across cultures, across materials, across time, leaving behind structures that still stand, not because they were the most advanced, but because they were built as if the world could change without warning. When a society builds with invisible forces in mind, its architecture stops being purely practical. It becomes anticipatory. You don't just respond to what is, you prepare for what could return. This changes the logic of design. You build margins into stone. You distribute stress instead of concentrating it. You accept complexity if it increases resilience. These are not the instincts of a culture discovering engineering for the first time. They are the instincts of a culture that has already seen failure. What if ancient builders remembered not just that catastrophe happened, but how it unfolded? Not the details, not the dates, but the forces involved. The shaking of the ground, the surge of water, the way structures failed first, and which ones lasted. That kind of memory doesn't survive as story alone. It survives as habit, as rules that feel unquestionable. Build this way, avoid that angle, use this mass, leave this margin. Even if the explanation is gone, the behavior remains. And over time, those behaviors harden into tradition. Sacred proportions, forbidden deviations, architectural laws that no one remembers creating. From the outside, it can look like mysticism. From the inside, it feels like responsibility. A duty to repeat what once kept people alive. If this is how knowledge crossed long stretches of time, then ancient architecture is not mysterious because it is primitive. It is mysterious because it is experienced. Experienced enough to know that some forces cannot be negotiated with, only anticipated. And that realization pushes the pattern one step further. Because if ancient societies were building in response to remembered catastrophe, then traces of that memory should appear not only in stone, but in story. And that is where the next layer of the pattern emerges, in warnings, in limits, and in the decision to restrict certain knowledge rather than spread it freely. When a society remembers catastrophe, it does not treat knowledge lightly. It doesn't assume that more understanding automatically leads to safety. It learns that some knowledge accelerates collapse as easily as it accelerates progress. Across ancient cultures, we see a recurring behavior. Knowledge is restricted. Astronomy is guarded by priesthoods. Calendars are controlled by elites. Construction techniques are passed through lineage, not manuals. Sacred measurements are hidden inside ritual rather than explained openly. From a modern perspective, this can look like power hoarding, or superstition, or fear of change. But what if it was something else? What if restriction was a response to memory? If a previous cycle ended because systems became unstable? too fast, too complex, too detached from the rhythms that sustained them. Then, controlling knowledge would feel like protection, not oppression. Limits would be a safeguard. Not everyone needs to know everything. Not every technique should spread unchecked. Not every discovery should be applied immediately. This attitude appears again and again in ancient warnings. Stories of forbidden knowledge, of fire stolen too early, of towers built too high, of wisdom that brings ruin when used without restraint. These myths are often read as moral lessons, but what if they are technical cautions, encoded as narrative? A way to say, we've been here before. And if that's true, then the ancient world wasn't afraid of knowledge. It was afraid of losing control of it, which reframes how we interpret silence in the record. What if some knowledge wasn't lost by accident, but deliberately slowed, fragmented, or hidden? Not to erase it, but to prevent another collapse. If civilization was already a restart, then restraint would feel more important than innovation. Survival would matter more than speed. And that brings us to a dangerous mirror. Because once we recognize this pattern, restriction after collapse, caution after acceleration, limits imposed by memory, we can't avoid asking the final question of this act. What happens when a civilization forgets why the limits were there in the first place? And what happens when it removes them? Limits only work while they are remembered. As long as a society understands why restraint exists, it respects the boundary. But memory erodes. Stories become symbols. Warnings become metaphors. Restrictions begin to feel arbitrary. At some point, a new generation asks a familiar question. Why not? Why not build higher? Why not measure more precisely? Why not accelerate what clearly works? And once that question is asked, the old limits start to weaken. What was once a safeguard begins to look like an obstacle. This is where cycles tend to tighten. Knowledge spreads faster than understanding. Tools outrun wisdom. Systems grow more powerful than stable. From the outside, this looks like progress. From the inside, it feels like momentum. And momentum is difficult to stop. If ancient civilizations remembered a collapse, then their restrictions make sense. But if later, civilizations inherited the restrictions without inheriting the memory of collapse, those limits would eventually be challenged. Not out of malice, out of confidence. Because confidence grows when nothing has gone wrong for a long time. And that is the most dangerous condition of all. A world that appears stable after forgetting how fragile it once was. If this pattern has played out before, then the collapse does not arrive suddenly. It arrives after restraint fades, after warnings feel outdated, after acceleration feels irresistible. And that realization quietly reframes the ruins we study. They are not monuments to ignorance. They may be the remains of civilizations that once believed they had finally moved beyond the need for limits, just as we often do now, which brings this act to its final tension. If knowledge cycles between restraint and release, between memory and forgetting, then collapse is not an accident. It is a phase. And that means the question is no longer whether civilizations fall, but whether they recognize the moment when restraint should return. And that question does not belong to the past alone. If collapse has happened before, then it may not be random. It may be instructional. Not in the sense of intention, but in consequence. When systems accelerate beyond their capacity to adapt, something intervenes. Sometimes it is internal. Political fracture, resource exhaustion, loss of coordination. Sometimes it is external. Climate shifts, seismic upheaval, rapid environmental change. Ancient traditions often describe these moments not as punishment, but as reset. Fire, flood, darkness, silence, then rebuilding. What if catastrophe was never understood as the end of history, but as a boundary between cycles? A hard stop that clears complexity faster than it can be dismantled. From that perspective, collapse is not failure. It is compression. What survives is not everything, only what can pass through. Stone survives. Alignment survives. Proportion survives. Habits survive. Excess dissolves. And when civilization returns, it returns simplified. More cautious. More symbolic. More focused on endurance than expansion. This could explain why post-collapse cultures often appear paradoxical. Technically sophisticated, yet socially restrained. Capable of astonishing engineering, yet hesitant to push it further. As if they were building under the shadow of something remembered. If catastrophe functions this way, then it is not the opposite of civilization. It is part of its rhythm. Growth, acceleration, instability, reset. And if that rhythm has repeated before, then the ancient world may not be warning us about the past. It may be describing a pattern, one that doesn't end, but loops, which brings us to the final shift of this section. Because once catastrophe is understood as a phase rather than a surprise, the focus changes. From what happened then to where we are now, and whether we can recognize the moment when restraint matters again. That is where the story turns inward. Catastrophe as a boundary, not a myth. If history moves in cycles, then the most important moments are not the collapses. They are the thresholds, the points where acceleration becomes irresistible, where systems grow too complex to fully understand, where tools spread faster than wisdom. What if we are living in one of those threshold moments now? In the last few centuries, and especially in the last few decades, human capability has expanded at a speed that would have looked impossible to any prior age. We don't just build structures, we build systems that think, networks that reach everywhere, machines that learn patterns we cannot fully explain. And the most unsettling part is not what we can do. It's how quickly it became normal. A person can carry more computing power in a pocket than nations once had in entire buildings. A small team can reshape economies. A single breakthrough can change the direction of global history. What if this is what acceleration looks like in every cycle? Not dramatic at first, not apocalyptic, just faster. Faster than adaptation, faster than regulation, faster than culture can update its instincts. And if ancient civilizations did experience similar thresholds, moments where knowledge surged ahead of stability, then the lesson wouldn't be, technology is bad. The lesson would be simpler. Speed has a cost. Because the faster a system grows, the harder it becomes to repair when it breaks, and the harder it becomes to remember what matters before it's lost. One of the clearest signs of a threshold is not innovation itself, it's opacity. Modern systems work, but fewer people understand how. We use tools we cannot fully explain. We depend on infrastructures no single mind can map. We trust algorithms whose inner logic even their creators struggle to describe. This isn't failure, it's scale. Complexity grows faster than comprehension. And this is not new. What if ancient civilizations reached similar moments, where systems became powerful enough that only fragments of understanding remained at the top? When that happens, knowledge stops being shared broadly. It becomes specialized, abstracted, detached from everyday experience. Most people don't know why things work. They only know that they do. And that creates vulnerability. Because when systems fail, repair requires understanding, not just usage. If the people who understand the system are few, or gone, or overwhelmed, the system collapses suddenly. This might explain why some ancient technologies appear to vanish overnight. Not because they were forgotten slowly, but because the network of understanding supporting them broke. Once that happens, what remains is form without explanation, which looks, to later observers, like mystery. If we are approaching a similar threshold, then the question isn't whether our technology will endure, it's whether our understanding will, and whether enough of it is distributed widely enough to survive disruption. Because once knowledge becomes opaque, collapse doesn't need an enemy. It only needs interruption. And interruption is never as rare as civilizations like to believe. Another sign of a threshold is dependence without awareness. Most people today don't know how electricity is generated, how water reaches their homes, how food moves from field to shelf, how data flows across continents in milliseconds. And yet, daily life assumes all of it will continue, seamlessly, silently, indefinitely. This isn't negligence. It's what complex systems require to function. No civilization can ask every individual to understand every layer of its infrastructure. But this creates a familiar imbalance. Capability spreads faster than resilience. Convenience grows faster than redundancy. Efficiency replaces robustness. What if ancient civilizations reached the same point? A moment where systems worked so well that contingency felt unnecessary. Where failure modes were known only to specialists. Where daily life depended on networks too intricate to rebuild, once disrupted. If those specialists were lost through conflict, disease, migration, or collapse, the system wouldn't degrade gracefully. It would fail abruptly, and to those who came later, the remnants would look inexplicable. Sophisticated structures with no clear method. Precise systems without instructions. Technology without a visible learning curve. Not because it was magical, but because the knowledge network that supported it had been too thin. If this pattern has repeated before, then the ruins we study are not warnings about ambition. They are warnings about concentration. About what happens when understanding becomes centralized and survival depends on uninterrupted continuity. Which raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. how many of our own systems would survive a sudden break in continuity, and how much of what we call progress would become unreadable to those who came after us. Progress feels like movement. Memory feels like weight. One pushes forward, the other holds back. Modern cultures tend to value the first and distrust the second. We celebrate speed, disruption, innovation that replaces what came before. Memory, by contrast, can feel conservative, restrictive, outdated. But in a cyclical view of history, memory plays a different role. It is not resistance to change. It is resistance to collapse. What if ancient civilizations understood something we have slowly forgotten? That progress without memory does not lead upward indefinitely. It leads outward until the structure holding it together thins too far. Memory preserves limits. It reminds a society where the edges are, which thresholds should not be crossed too quickly. When memory fades, progress accelerates, and acceleration feels good right up until it becomes unstable. If earlier civilizations encoded memory into architecture, ritual, and restriction, it may not have been because they feared the future. It may have been because they had already seen one, a future that arrived too fast. Systems that grew too complex to repair. Knowledge that advanced faster than it could be integrated. From that perspective, ancient restraint is not primitive. It is strategic, a choice to slow down after something had already gone wrong once. And that forces us to ask a question that sits uncomfortably close to the present. If we prioritize progress and neglect memory, are we advancing? Or are we simply accelerating toward the same point from which others once had to rebuild? There is a moment in every cycle when memory begins to feel unnecessary. Nothing has failed for a long time. Systems appear stable. Growth seems self-sustaining. At that point, restraint looks like hesitation. Caution feels like fear. Why slow down when everything is working? This is usually when limits are reinterpreted. What once existed to prevent instability is reframed as an obstacle to efficiency. What once protected continuity is labeled as resistance to progress. And so the safeguards are relaxed. Redundancy is removed to optimize performance. Margins are tightened to increase output. Systems are pushed closer to their limits because they seem to tolerate it. What if this is the most dangerous phase of any cycle? Not collapse itself, but the confidence that collapse is no longer possible. Ancient cultures encoded their warnings in story and structure because they knew memory fades faster than danger. Once the reason for restraint is forgotten, only the restraint itself remains. And without context, restraint never survives long. It is questioned, then ignored, then removed. If history truly moves in cycles, then collapse does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives after forgetting feels complete, after memory has been replaced by momentum. Which means the most important question is not how advanced a civilization becomes, but whether it remembers why it once chose to slow down. Because the moment memory is dismissed as obsolete, the cycle has already turned. And from there, events tend to move very quickly. When memory fades and acceleration takes over, the pattern becomes familiar. Complex systems multiply, dependencies deepen, failures become systemic rather than local. A small disruption no longer stays small, it cascades. What once would have been an inconvenience becomes a crisis. What if this is the stage every advanced civilization reaches shortly before the cycle turns? Not because it lacks intelligence, not because it lacks technology, but because it has outgrown its ability to understand itself. At that point, resilience is replaced by optimization. Depth is replaced by speed. And long-term thinking gives way to immediate advantage. From the inside, this feels like success. From the outside, and in hindsight, it looks like fragility. If earlier civilizations reached this phase, their collapse would not have looked dramatic at first. It would have looked like normal life continuing, until it didn't. And when the break came, it would not erase everything equally. What survives is never the most complex layer. What survives is what was built to endure when systems fail. Stone, alignment, habit, story. Everything else dissolves. If this pattern has repeated before, then the ruins we study are not warnings carved in anger. They are leftovers, the durable residue of civilizations that once believed their systems were permanent. And that realization leads to the final, quiet turn of the story. Because if collapse is not the exception, but part of the cycle, then the most important moment is not the fall itself. It is the moment just before it. The moment when a civilization still has a choice, whether to continue accelerating or to remember why restraint once mattered. And that is the question history may be asking us again. Just before a cycle turns, there is usually a moment of recognition, not public, not dramatic, quiet. A sense that systems are moving faster than wisdom can follow. That stability is being assumed rather than maintained. That continuity depends on everything working at once. Ancient civilizations may have felt this too. A moment when monuments were no longer built to explore new ideas, but to hold on to old ones. When knowledge stopped expanding and started being guarded. When memory became more valuable than progress. If that moment existed before, then it may explain why some cultures shifted their focus inward, why they emphasized ritual over innovation, why they repeated forms instead of improving them, why they encoded limits into story and stone. Not because they had lost ambition, but because they recognized danger. This is the phase where a civilization can still choose to slow down, to reintroduce margins, to value resilience over reach, or to continue accelerating, trusting that momentum will carry it through. History suggests which choice is more common, and it also suggests what follows. Because when restraint fails to return, the cycle does not end with answers. It ends with silence. A silence that future generations will try to interpret from what remains. Which brings us to the final act. Not about what ancient civilizations were, but about what remains after a cycle completes. And what questions those remains quietly ask of anyone who comes after. Technology, speed, and the familiar pattern. Every civilization that reaches a certain level of complexity begins to believe the same thing, that this time is different. that past collapses happened because people were less informed, less connected, less advanced? What if that belief appears in every cycle, not as arrogance, but as confidence built on genuine achievement? After all, we can measure the planet, model the climate, simulate economies, predict behavior with algorithms. We don't rely on myth, we rely on data. And yet, earlier civilizations believed the same in their own way. They trusted their calendars, their alignments, their systems of law and measurement. They believed they had understood the forces that governed their world. What if the illusion isn't ignorance, but completeness? The feeling that nothing fundamental remains unknown, that whatever risks exist can be managed from inside the system. If history truly moves in cycles, then this belief would not be a mistake unique to us. It would be a phase, the moment when success becomes its own evidence, and when questioning the direction of progress starts to feel unnecessary, or even irrational, because everything still works. For now, one of the strongest forms of confidence is familiarity. When systems surround us from birth, they stop feeling fragile. Electricity feels permanent. Information feels infinite. Connectivity feels irreversible. What if earlier civilizations experienced the same sensation? Not ignorance of risk, but intimacy with their tools. When a system works every day, it stops being questioned. It becomes background, and background feels eternal. This is how vulnerability hides, not through denial, but through normalization. The more reliable a system appears, the harder it is to imagine it failing completely. What if this is why cycles repeat? Not because civilizations don't see danger, but because danger no longer feels real. It feels theoretical, manageable, external, something that happens to others, in other times, under different conditions, until suddenly it isn't. And by then, the moment for restraint has already passed. There is another layer to this illusion. Comparison. Modern societies don't just look forward, they look backward. We compare ourselves to collapsed civilizations and measure how far we've come. They lacked science. They lacked global coordination. They lacked redundancy. We have all of that. So collapse begins to look like a solved problem. What if that comparison is misleading? What if every civilization compares itself only to those that failed earlier in the cycle, not to those that failed at the same level of complexity? We don't see ourselves in small, fragmented societies. We see ourselves as something beyond them. But earlier, advanced civilizations may have felt exactly the same. They too had systems no one before them had ever managed. They too believed they had crossed a threshold from which collapse was no longer possible. And what if that belief is the most reliable signal of all? Not that a civilization is wrong, but that it has reached a familiar point, where success is no longer questioned, where difference is assumed, where the past is treated as something primitive rather than something cyclical. If that pattern holds, then believing we are different doesn't make us safer. It places us exactly where others once stood, just before history stopped feeling relevant. The illusion strengthens when success becomes self-justifying, when growth is used as proof of stability, when scale is mistaken for resilience, when complexity is confused with control. At that stage, warning signs don't disappear. They get reinterpreted. Stress becomes temporary volatility. Instability becomes a transition phase. Systemic risk becomes an edge case. What if this reframing has happened before? Not as deception, but as adaptation of language. Because once a civilization defines itself as fundamentally different from everything that came before, any comparison feels irrelevant. History stops being a mirror. It becomes a museum. Interesting. Educational. Safely distant. And when history is no longer felt as something that could repeat, its lessons lose urgency. They become stories about them, not signals about us. If cycles are real, this may be the most subtle turning point of all. Not collapse, not crisis, but the moment when history stops feeling personal and starts feeling finished. Even though the pattern may still be unfolding, quietly beneath the surface. At the height of this illusion, the question itself begins to change. It is no longer, could this fail? It becomes, why would it? Failure requires imagination, and imagination weakens when systems appear total. What if earlier civilizations did not collapse because they ignored danger, but because they could no longer picture it? When every part of life is integrated into one system, there is no outside reference point, no alternative model, no memory of functioning differently. Stability stops being something you maintain. It becomes something you assume. And assumption is fragile. If this stage appears in every cycle, then the danger is not technological. It is psychological. The quiet certainty that we have outgrown the patterns that governed everyone else. If that certainty feels familiar, it may not be because it is true. It may be because this is exactly how a cycle feels from the inside, just before the question changes again. From, why would it fail, to, how did this happen? There is a moment when capability grows faster than interpretation. Tools become more powerful than the stories we use to explain them. We can do things before we fully understand what they do to us. What if this gap has appeared before? In earlier cycles, power may not have meant electricity or code. It may have meant precision, scale, the ability to reshape landscapes or track the sky with increasing accuracy. And at first, that power would feel clarifying. More control, more certainty, more alignment with the world. But meaning takes longer to evolve than capability. Values lag behind tools. Ethics trail technique. Understanding arrives after application. What if this delay is built into every cycle? A phase where what can be done no longer fits comfortably inside what is understood. At that point, power stops being integrated. It becomes abstract, something you use without fully situating it inside a coherent worldview. And when power loses meaning, it doesn't disappear. It accelerates. Because without meaning, there is nothing to slow it down. No internal boundary. No shared sense of enough. If ancient civilizations reached this phase, their collapse would not have begun with failure. It would have begun with success that no longer knew what it was for. When meaning falls behind power, decisions become technical instead of reflective. The question stops being, should this exist, It becomes, can we make it work? And if the answer is yes, the project moves forward. What if this shift has happened before? In earlier cycles, the tools were different, but the pattern was the same. Measurement outpaced wisdom. Engineering outpaced restraint. Capability outpaced context. Once a system proves effective, it begins to justify itself. Efficiency becomes its own argument. Precision becomes proof of correctness. Scale becomes evidence of necessity. At that stage, meaning is no longer debated. It is assumed. And assumed meaning rarely survives stress. Because when pressure arrives, only integrated understanding holds. If power is abstract, if it is disconnected from shared values, then no one knows where to stop. Not because they want collapse, but because there is no longer a clear definition of balance. What if ancient civilizations reached this same inflection point? A moment when their tools worked too well for their stories to keep up. When knowledge was no longer embedded in ritual, myth, and restraint, but isolated as technique. If so, then collapse would not feel like failure at first. It would feel like momentum. A world moving forward without asking where forward was supposed to lead. Momentum has a particular quality. It feels neutral, objective, unstoppable in a way that seems impersonal. No one is choosing the direction anymore. The system is. What if this is the most dangerous transition in any cycle? When responsibility dissolves into process, when outcomes are attributed to how things work now, rather than to deliberate choices. At that point, power no longer belongs to people. People belong to the system that channels it. In earlier civilizations, this may have looked different. Priestly calendars no longer questioned. Engineering traditions followed without reflection. Knowledge repeated because it worked, not because it was still understood. The system becomes sacred simply because it exists, and sacred systems are hard to interrupt. What if collapse does not begin when power is abused, but when power becomes automatic? When no one feels authorized to ask whether the direction still makes sense? Because once momentum replaces meaning, there is no clear place to apply restraint. Everything continues until something external forces a stop. And when that stop arrives, it never feels deserved. It feels sudden, unfair, as if history itself intervened without warning, even though the warning was the absence of meaning long before the break. When meaning no longer anchors power, language begins to thin. Complex actions are explained with simple terms. Deep consequences are reduced to metrics. Success is measured, not understood. What if this linguistic flattening is another recurring signal? When systems grow too intricate to explain honestly, they are explained efficiently instead. Risk becomes a percentage. Impact becomes a projection. Responsibility becomes a function. This makes power easier to manage and harder to question. Earlier civilizations may have experienced the same shift. Rituals performed without comprehension. Calendars followed without reflection. Alignments preserved because deviation felt dangerous, not because meaning was still alive. At that stage, knowledge survives, but understanding does not. And without understanding, correction becomes impossible, because you can't adjust what you can no longer interpret. If this phase appears in every cycle, then collapse doesn't begin with ignorance. It begins with fluency. The ability to operate systems smoothly without being able to say what they are ultimately for. And once that happens, power no longer needs intention. It simply needs continuity. Until continuity breaks. At this point in a cycle, power no longer feels like a choice. It feels like gravity. Something you adjust to. Something you optimize around. Something you stop imagining without. What if this is why restraint becomes almost impossible here? Because restraint requires a shared sense of meaning, a reason to pause that feels legitimate to everyone involved. But when meaning has thinned, pause looks like inefficiency. Reflection looks like delay. Limits look like failure to compete. Earlier civilizations may have crossed this same threshold. Their systems worked. Their calendars aligned. Their engineering endured. So why stop? Why question what clearly functions? And yet, if power has outpaced meaning, function alone is not enough. Because function doesn't tell you when to slow down. It doesn't tell you what should never be optimized. Doesn't tell you what the system is meant to preserve when conditions change. If ancient collapses followed this phase, then the lesson is not about excess power. It's about power without orientation, strength without direction, capability without context. And that leaves us with the quiet transition into the next section. Because when power continues to grow and meaning can no longer catch up, something else begins to appear. Signals, subtle at first, easy to rationalize. Signs that the system is under strain and that the cycle is nearing another turn. There is a stage in every cycle when repetition becomes invisible. Not because it stops, but because it is reframed. Patterns are renamed as progress. Acceleration is described as inevitability. Instability is treated as noise. What if this is the moment when cycles are hardest to recognize? When events still fit inside familiar explanations? When disruptions are localized, manageable, temporary? When every warning has a model, a forecast, a plan? Earlier civilizations may have experienced this same calm, not peace, but confidence. A sense that whatever happens next will still be handled within the system. And because everything still works, no one thinks in terms of cycles. Cycles belong to the past, to myth, to primitive thinking. Modernity defines itself by having escaped them. But what if that belief is itself part of the pattern? What if cycles don't announce themselves with catastrophe, but with plausibility? With explanations that always seem sufficient, until suddenly they aren't. If that's true, then the most dangerous moment is not when things break. It's when everything still makes sense. Because that's when repetition hides best, and when the opportunity to change course quietly slips by unnoticed. At this stage, warning signs don't disappear. They become explainable. Every signal has a chart. Every anomaly has a precedent. Every strain has a temporary cause. Nothing feels unmanageable on its own. What if earlier civilizations experienced the same narrowing of attention? Small failures interpreted in isolation. Local disruptions treated as unrelated events. Systemic stress broken into categories, so it never has to be seen whole. This is how patterns dissolve. not by being hidden, but by being divided. When problems are compartmentalized, no single moment feels decisive enough to justify restraint. There is always time later. Always another adjustment. Always another layer of optimization. Cycles don't end in denial, they end in postponement. If collapse requires recognition to be avoided, then this phase is critical, because by the time the pattern becomes obvious, it is usually no longer adjustable. What remains is reaction, not choice. And that is the defining feature of this moment. Everything is still explainable, but no longer steerable, which means the cycle doesn't turn with a crash. It turns quietly, while everyone is busy making sense of the pieces. Another thing changes at this stage. Responsibility diffuses. No single decision feels decisive. No single actor feels accountable for the whole. Outcomes emerge from interaction, not intention. What if earlier civilizations reached the same condition? A point where no one was choosing collapse, but no one could stop it either. Systems became too interdependent, too optimized, too distributed to pause. Each part worked as designed. The failure existed only at the level of the whole, and wholes are easy to ignore when everyone operates locally. This is how cycles complete without drama, not through a single mistake, but through many correct decisions made inside a structure that can no longer change direction. If that pattern has repeated before, then the end of a cycle is not marked by ignorance. It is marked by competence applied too narrowly. Everyone doing their job well, inside a system that has lost the ability to reflect on itself. And when reflection disappears, history doesn't need to intervene loudly. It only needs to stop cooperating. At that point, the cycle has already turned, even if no one has noticed yet. At the final stage of this phase, even the idea of a turning point feels unrealistic. There is no clear before and after. No single event to mark the change. Everything blends. What if earlier civilizations crossed this threshold without ever naming it? Their calendars still worked. Their buildings still stood. Their systems still functioned, just under increasing strain. From the inside, nothing looks like collapse. It looks like complexity. More rules, more coordination, more layers added to stabilize what already exists. But each layer makes the system harder to steer. At this point, cycles don't feel like cycles. They feel like permanence. And that is the quiet danger. Because when permanence is assumed, preparation stops. Redundancy feels wasteful. Resilience feels unnecessary. Memory feels outdated. If history has repeated this moment before, then collapse didn't arrive as a lesson. It arrived as a correction. Not because people ignored the past, but because the past no longer felt applicable. Which brings us to the next shift. Because when cycles are no longer obvious, signals have to become stronger to be noticed. And that is when the system begins to speak in a different language. Not through myth or monument, but through strain, through disruption, through signs that are still easy to dismiss until they are not. Signals rarely arrive as declarations. They arrive as inconvenience, small interruptions, localized failures, events that don't quite fit expectations, but still fit explanations. What if this is how cycles announce themselves? not with a warning loud enough to force action, but with friction subtle enough to be absorbed. Systems slow slightly. Margins tighten. Recovery takes longer than it used to. Nothing breaks completely. Nothing demands a halt. So the signals are labeled anomaly, outlier, temporary shock. Earlier civilizations may have recognized these signs too and dismissed them for the same reason. They were survivable. Each one, on its own, proved that the system still worked. And that proof became reassurance. What if the danger of signals is not that they are ignored, but that they are handled successfully? Because successful handling delays recognition. It teaches the system that adaptation is enough, that no deeper change is required, until the signals stop arriving one at a time and begin to overlap. That is when a civilization discovers that it has been responding tactically to something that required reflection. And by then, the cycle is no longer approaching. It is already unfolding. As signals accumulate, they start to interfere with each other. One disruption is manageable. Two are inconvenient. Several at once begin to feel confusing. Not catastrophic, just harder to interpret. What if earlier civilizations reached this phase too? A point where stresses overlapped in ways no single explanation could fully address. Environmental pressure mixed with social strain. Technological dependence intersected with resource limits. Local solutions solved local problems, while the larger pattern remained unseen. This is where signals become dangerous, not because they are dramatic, but because they compete for attention. Each one demands a response. Each one feels urgent. And together, they leave no space to step back and ask the deeper question. What is changing underneath all of this? When attention is consumed by reaction, reflection disappears. And without reflection, signals lose their meaning. They are treated as noise instead of message. If cycles repeat, this is the stage where civilizations are busiest and least aware. Not asleep, not ignorant. Simply focused on keeping everything working one adjustment at a time. And that focus, while necessary in the short term, can quietly carry a society past the point where a different choice was still possible. At this stage, something subtle happens to perception. Signals stop being read as warnings and start being treated as features of the environment. Instability becomes the new normal. Volatility becomes something to plan around. Uncertainty becomes background noise. What if earlier civilizations normalized strain in exactly the same way? When disruptions last long enough, they stop feeling temporary. They become conditions. And once a condition is accepted, it no longer demands change, only management. This is how a civilization adapts to what it should be questioning. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" the focus shifts to, "How do we operate inside it?" And that shift matters, because management assumes continuity. It assumes the system will persist, even if it is under pressure. Warnings, by contrast, demand interruption. They ask for pause, reassessment, possibly reversal. But reversal feels unrealistic once a condition has been normalized. If cycles repeat, this is the moment when signals lose their urgency. Not because they are weak, but because they are constant. And constant signals no longer feel like messages. They feel like weather. Something to endure. Something to adapt to. Something that no longer feels like it can be changed. And that is often the last stage before a system learns whether adaptation was enough, or whether something deeper was being asked for all along. The final warning signs are often the least dramatic. They don't announce themselves as danger. They arrive as fatigue, slower recovery, thinner margins, less room for error. What once felt resilient now feels fragile, but only in hindsight. What if earlier civilizations noticed this too? A sense that everything required more effort than it used to. That coordination was harder. That trust in systems quietly eroded, even while the system still functioned. This is where cycles become irreversible. Not because collapse is inevitable, but because recognition comes too late. By the time fatigue is widespread, the system has already adapted to operating under strain, and adaptation can mask decline. It allows a civilization to continue long after the conditions that supported it have begun to disappear. If cycles repeat, this stage is not loud. It is quiet. A slow narrowing of options. A gradual loss of flexibility. A sense that the future feels tighter than the past did. And when that feeling becomes common, the choice is no longer between paths. It is between responses. The cycle has already turned, even if no one has named it yet. Every cycle contains a moment that does not feel important at the time. No announcement, no clear marker, no consensus that history is turning. Just a fork. Two directions that look almost identical from the inside. One path continues acceleration, optimization, adaptation within existing assumptions. The other introduces pause, not collapse, not rejection of progress, restraint. What if this fork appears in every cycle and is almost always missed? Because it doesn't look like a choice. It looks like patience versus impatience, maintenance versus expansion, redundancy versus efficiency. From within a system under strain, choosing restraint can feel irrational. Why slow down when so much still works? Why add margins when resources feel tight? Why question direction when momentum has carried us this far? Earlier civilizations may have stood at the same fork, not knowing it was final, not knowing it would define what survived the next disruption. Because the fork is not between success and failure. It is between building for continuity or building for speed. And the consequences of that choice are never immediate. They only become visible after the cycle has already moved on. What makes this fork so difficult to recognize is that both paths feel reasonable. Acceleration promises solutions. Restraint promises delay. One speaks the language of urgency. The other speaks the language of patience. What if earlier civilizations chose acceleration not because they were reckless, but because it felt responsible? When systems are under pressure, speed feels like competence. Expansion feels like security. Innovation feels like control. Restraint, by contrast, feels passive, indecisive, even dangerous. Why slow down when challenges are multiplying? Why reduce complexity when complexity seems to be what's holding everything together? And yet, if cycles repeat, this is exactly where the choice matters most. Because acceleration commits a civilization to its current assumptions. It doubles down on the idea that the system, as designed, can handle whatever comes next. Restraint does something else. It admits uncertainty. It creates space for systems to be understood again, not just operated. It values what survives interruption over what performs best under ideal conditions. If ancient civilizations faced this same fork, their ruins suggest which choice was more common, not because restraint was wrong, but because it was harder to justify while everything still appeared functional. And that may be the most unsettling part. The fork does not punish mistakes. It rewards confidence. Right up until confidence is no longer enough. There is one more reason this fork is so often missed. It doesn't announce consequences. Acceleration does not immediately destroy. Restraint does not immediately save. Both paths look calm at first. What if earlier civilizations never realized which choice they had made until much later? They built a little faster, optimized a little more, trusted their systems a little longer. Nothing broke. So the decision felt validated. Restraint, on the other hand, offers no proof in the present. You slow down, and nothing dramatic happens. No reward, no visible success, just the quiet absence of crisis. And absence is hard to credit. If cycles repeat, this may be why history looks cruel in hindsight. Not because people chose collapse, but because they chose what worked, what was measurable, what showed results. The fork does not separate wisdom from error. It separates short-term coherence from long-term continuity. And from inside the moment, those two can look identical until the conditions change. And then, only one of them still holds. There is a final detail that makes this fork almost invisible. Both paths use the same language. Acceleration talks about resilience. Optimization talks about sustainability. Expansion talks about adaptation. The words sound right. They always have. What if earlier civilizations used them too? Different terms, different myths, but the same reassurance. That this growth is controlled, that this complexity is understood, that this system has safeguards. Restraint, by contrast, struggles to speak. It doesn't promise growth. It doesn't produce impressive metrics. It doesn't generate immediate relief. It simply asks for space. Space to understand. Space to remember. Space to decide what must survive if everything else fails. In a world under pressure, space feels like a luxury. So it is postponed, deferred, left for later. If cycles repeat, this may be the most consistent mistake of all. Not ignoring danger, not denying reality, but delaying reflection until the system no longer has room for it. And once that space is gone, the fork disappears. The path continues forward, not because it was chosen, but because it was never paused. Which brings us to the edge of the story. Because once the fork has passed, history does not ask loudly anymore. It waits. And then it answers in silence. Final. The question that remains. When a cycle completes, there is no announcement. No voice that says, this is the moment history turned. There is only aftermath. People later point to dates, to events, to disasters. But the real turning point always happened earlier, in the quiet, in the ordinary, in decisions that felt reasonable at the time. The ruins we study are not warnings written in stone. They are residues. What remains after acceleration outruns memory, after systems lose the ability to pause, after confidence replaces reflection. Stone survives because it was built for interruption. Alignment survives because it assumed continuity could fail. Patterns survive because they were designed to outlast explanation. Everything else dissolves. If ancient civilizations moved through cycles of growth, forgetting, and reset, then the most important part of their story was never the collapse. It was the moment just before it. The moment when restraint still made sense, but no longer felt urgent. The moment when memory could still slow progress, but was already being questioned. That is the moment history seems to return to again and again. Not to accuse, not to threaten, but to ask. Not who they were, not what they built, but whether those who came after could recognize the same pattern from the inside. So tonight, wherever you are listening from, in a world of networks, speed, and invisible systems, consider this quietly. If history is cyclical, then the question is not how advanced we are. It is whether we can recognize the point in the cycle we are standing in before it only becomes visible in ruins. Because history does not repeat to be remembered. It repeats until it is recognized. And recognition, unlike collapse, is one of the few things that can still change what survives next. There is something else the ruins never tell us. They don't say we were warned. They don't say we chose wrong. They don't say anything at all. Meaning is assigned afterward by those who arrive later and try to reconstruct intention from what endured. That silence is important because it suggests that no civilization ever believes it is standing at the end of a cycle. From the inside, everything still feels open. Plans extend forward. Systems still respond. Tomorrow still assumes itself. What if this is why history feels unfair in retrospect? Because the moment that mattered most didn't feel like a moment at all. It felt like continuity. Like one more reasonable decision inside a system that had always rewarded reason. And that is known only later, when continuity breaks and people look back trying to locate the exact second everything changed. But cycles don't hinge on seconds. They hinge on orientation. On whether a civilization is still capable of stepping outside its own momentum long enough to ask, what is this actually building toward? And what must survive if it doesn't? That question is never asked loudly. It is asked quietly by individuals, often dismissed as cautious, slow, or unrealistic. And sometimes, just sometimes, it is asked early enough to matter. History never tells us whether anyone recognized the moment in time. We don't know who paused, who hesitated, who sensed that something familiar was returning under a different name. Those people rarely leave monuments. They leave absences. A technology not pushed further. A scale not exceeded. A system intentionally kept simpler than it could have been. Those choices are almost invisible in the record. Archaeology preserves what was built, not what was restrained. And yet, Restraint may be the most important technology of all. If cycles are real, then collapse is not the lesson. The lesson is recognition, the ability to feel when momentum has replaced meaning, when speed has outrun memory, when confidence has grown quiet enough to stop asking questions. So the story does not end with an answer. It ends with awareness, the same awareness every civilization briefly touches before history decides whether it will become a continuation or a restart. And that is why the past matters. Not because it explains what happened, but because it shows how often the same question has already been asked. Softly, without drama, right before everything changed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. History does not force recognition. It offers it quietly. It leaves traces, patterns, echoes, not to convince, but to invite attention. If ancient civilizations encoded memory into stone, alignment, and restraint, they may not have been trying to warn the future. They may have been trying to remind themselves that cycles feel invisible while you're inside them, that acceleration always feels justified, that collapse is rarely imagined until it has already passed. So this story does not ask you to believe that humanity has risen and fallen before. It asks something smaller. What if the most important moments in history are not the dramatic ones we remember, but the quiet ones we barely notice? The moments when everything still works, when no alarm is loud enough to interrupt momentum, when the choice is still available, but easy to postpone. If history is cyclical, then the question is not whether we are advanced. It is whether we are attentive, whether we can recognize the familiar shape of this moment before it is only visible in hindsight. Because civilizations do not disappear when they lack intelligence. They disappear when they lose the ability to pause. And if that has happened before, then the past is not behind us. It is standing beside us, asking the same quiet question again. Not urgently, not dramatically, just softly enough that it can still be missed. So the story ends where it began. Not with proof, not with certainty, not with a conclusion. Only with a question that refuses to stay in the past. What if the greatest civilizations were not destroyed by ignorance, but by familiarity? By the sense that everything essential had already been solved? By the belief that the systems surrounding them were permanent enough to stop being examined? If that is true, then the ancient world is not a warning carved in stone. It is a mirror, not showing us what will happen, but showing us a shape that history has taken before. And shapes matter. They repeat even when names change, even when tools evolve, even when the story we tell ourselves feels new. So the most important question isn't whether ancient civilizations existed before the ones we know. It's whether we can recognize the moment when history asks us the same question again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, while everything still works. And whether this time we notice before the silence has to do the remembering for us. And after the question is asked, nothing forces an answer. History does not pause to wait. It continues moving, regardless of whether it is noticed. Civilizations don't fail because they choose the wrong ending. They fail because they never realize they are standing in a moment that can be chosen at all. If cycles exist, then the rarest thing in history is not survival. It is awareness at the right time. So this is not a conclusion. It is a still frame. A moment held see-through before momentum decides for us. Wherever you are listening from, under ancient stars or modern lights, the question does not demand belief, only attention. Because if history truly moves in cycles, then the difference between a collapse and a continuation is not knowledge. It is timing, and the quiet ability to recognize the shape of a familiar moment while you are still inside it. And perhaps that is where this story is meant to stop. Not at an answer, not at a revelation, not at a declaration about the past or the future, but at a pause. A moment where the noise of explanation fades and only the pattern remains. Civilizations rise, they accelerate, they normalize complexity, they forget why limits existed, they assume permanence. And then history becomes quiet for a while. When it speaks again, it does so through remnants, through stone that outlived intention, through alignments that survived belief, through systems that worked long enough to be misunderstood. If there is any inheritance left to us, it may not be knowledge. It may be the opportunity to notice the moment. Because the most important turning points are never marked by catastrophe. They are marked by comfort, by confidence, by the feeling that there is still time. So the question does not ask for fear, or urgency, or conclusions. It asks for awareness. What if history isn't waiting for us to fail, but waiting to see whether we recognize the pattern early enough to choose differently? And if we don't, the cycle will not punish us. It will simply continue, quietly, as it always has. And after that, nothing more needs to be said. Because the question doesn't belong to the narrator, or to history, or even to this story. It belongs to the listener. Every cycle ends the same way, not with a lesson written clearly, but with a silence that waits to see what will be done next. Some civilizations fill that silence with more speed, more reach, more certainty. Others, very rarely, fill it with pause, with attention, with restraint, with the choice to remember before remembering is forced. We don't know which path was taken before. We only see what survived. And survival never tells the whole story. It only shows what endured interruption. So this story does not ask you to believe in lost civilizations, or forgotten technologies, or hidden histories. It asks something quieter. What if the most important knowledge is not about the past at all, but about recognizing when the present begins to feel familiar in the same way the past once did? If history truly moves in cycles, then awareness is not the end of the story. It is the rare moment when the story can still change. And that moment, if it exists at all, is always now. Good night.